Hi, this is Craig Stocks here for Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And this is the second of two parts of a video looking at going from this version of the Angelfish Dark Nebula to this version using PixInsight and Photoshop. So we've already gone through the PixInsight part of the process, and just to quickly review where we left off, we created the two star images, the sharp stars and the fluffy stars, and then we also saved this copy of the nebula itself as the background. And what we want to do now is load those into Photoshop and continue through the process of going to this from this. So to do that, if you've watched any of my videos, you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. And what that means is actually it loads files as layers. And we'll just browse to find the layers, the files that we want to load into layers. And it will present us with this Open File dialog box where we can select multiple images. So we'll just navigate to the folder where we saved our files, and there are I'm not sure why there's 4, but we'll sort it out once we get into Photoshop. It'll give us the list of files here, and then just click OK, and that will open those 4 files, and they'll open over here. You'll see them in the layers palette over on the right hand side, and this is where we'll be doing the bulk of the work. And let me talk a little bit about the file organization. You can change the interface in Photoshop to suit however you want to work. PixInsight is a little bit the same way. You can customize the interface. I use what's known as the Essentials workspace as my basis, and I have 3 palettes that are always open over here on the right hand side. At the bottom I have the Layers palette, and this is where you'll be able to see all of the individual layers. In the middle I have the Adjustments panel, and each one of these icons represents a different adjustment layer. We don't want to ever adjust the layer itself, the pixels themselves. We want to use an adjustment layer because that's non-destructive and we can always tweak it and change our mind later. And the ones that I use most often will be this one, which is the Levels adjustment. The next one over I occasionally use, which is Curves. Hue and Saturation I'll use quite a bit right here, and then the Color Balance right here. Those are the 4 that I use most of the time. And then at the top is the Properties panel, and what the Properties panel shows you is the properties of whatever you have selected down here. So for instance, if I have a levels adjustment layer selected, it will show me the settings for that levels adjustment. The levels adjustment is very similar to the histogram adjustment tool in PixInsight. And we'll save our document in a native Photoshop format, either a .psd or a .psb, and that will preserve all of these layers and their organization and all of the adjustment layers fully intact so that it's all non-destructive and you can come back to it later. I probably will do some destructive things along the way. Somebody called me out for that last time, and they're right. 2 reasons. One is I usually take some shortcuts, especially in a video, but if it's not particularly related to what I'm trying to demonstrate. But also I find I almost never want to restore a defect that I've taken out. Especially if it's something away from the main subject of the image, and so I will frequently just clobber something destructively and not worry about it too much because it's not pertinent to the image, and in fact that area is probably going to be cropped out. So the first thing we need to do is some organization, and what we want to do is organize our stars at the top. And if you remember, we have a layer of sharp stars, and that's the one that's on top, and then we have a layer of fluffy stars. And I actually want to reverse that order, so I'm just going to click and hold on this layer and drag it up so that now we have the fluffy stars on top of the sharp stars. And you'll notice when I did that, the picture changed, and that's because by default each layer is going to be in a normal blending mode, and those blending modes are right here. You can see right now it says normal, and that blending mode is what determines how a layer interacts with what's below it. And there's a whole assortment. If we click on the drop down, you can see there's a whole range of different blending modes. Normal is at the top, and there's even an additional one that'll show up if you have a layer group. It'll be pass through, which is like normal for a group. The first set all basically use the layer you're on to darken what you can see below, and that's darken, multiply, color burn, linear burn, darker color. These are all different versions of using this layer to darken what's below. The next group is actually what we want. It contains lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, and so forth. And what these do is lighten what's below. And what's particularly nice about this, the star layers come out with the stars being the only bright spots against a pure black background. A pure black background, if you want a numerical value, it would be 0. And a pure black background can't lighten anything that's below it. So in effect, it's just going to be invisible if we put it over something else. If I change this fluffy stars to lighten blending mode, what it's doing then is using the fluffy outside just to lighten what's below, and what's below is the sharp star. The other thing I can do with this is I can play with the opacity. I don't have to blend it at 100%. Right next to the blending modes, you see the word opacity and a drop down that you can use 100%, 50%, 20%, 0. You can move this slider back and forth to adjust the opacity of this layer. You could also type in a number such as 47 to get 47% opacity. Most of the tools in Photoshop also support what's called a scrubby slider. If I move my cursor over the word opacity, you can see that the finger now has a little arrow pointing left and right. I can just move over the word, click and drag, and that will drag the opacity left and right. And the last thing I can do if I'm on a tool that doesn't support opacity, such as the Move tool, if I just tap the 5 key, that would immediately go to 50% opacity. A 2 would be 20% opacity, 0 would be 100% opacity, and so forth. And I usually find with the fluffy stars that somewhere around 30–40% will wind up working about right. So I want to put these in a group so that they can function together as one image, even though it's actually made up of 2. To do that, I'll click on both layers, and then I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Control-G. You could also do the same thing with the icon at the bottom of the layers palette. And what that'll do is just drop the selected layers into a group. So now we have a group. In that group, if I click on the little disclosure chevron, you can see it opens up the group. There are the 2 layers or 2 files that we loaded. I can double click where it says group 1 to change the name to stars. And the last thing we want to do is change the blending mode of this entire group from pass through, which is like normal only for groups, to screen. If you remember when we took the stars out, we said we were going to unscreen the stars. So we'll use screen to put the stars back in. So now we have the stars put back in on top of our image. And just to help clean things up, I'm going to turn the star layer off. That mystery 4th file, that was actually my copy of the starting point. So we'll just move that to the top because we may want to use that as a reference to see a before and after, and I'll just turn it off for now. So there is the layer that we saved. after we stretched and removed the stars. And if I turn the star layer back on, we can see already that that's better than that, but we can do a lot better. So let's keep working on it. I'm going to do quite a bit of work with this background layer. So the first thing I want to do is put it in its own group also, just for housekeeping. So again, with that layer selected, Control G, double click on the group 1 name and change that to RGB or whatever you want to designate. And now we have to do some cleanup. If I zoom in, we see that there's some what looks like residuals, but if you zoom in, you can see those are actually galaxies. Those aren't defects, those are galaxies. This is actually a defect. This is a galaxy, and then this is a defect. So these are not important areas, so we just want to get rid of it. And a good tool to do that is, and this is fairly new in the newer versions, is this remove tool. And with the remove tool, I can use the left and right bracket keys to make that brush bigger and smaller. Just move over the thing you want to remove, click and paint, and unclick, and it uses sampling of the area around it, maybe even a little artificial intelligence, and it removes that thing and blends it in with the background. So that's gone. Now we could, right now I have this on sample all layers. If you want to do this non-destructively, and this is the only layer that's active, but if I add a blank layer right above the layer that we were looking at, so now we're on a blank layer sitting right above the layer that we're wanting to work on. If I want to do this non-destructively, and let's say I want to non-destructively remove this little flare over here, on the blank layer and with the sample all layers checkbox, I can just paint over this area, and it's going to do the same thing. It's going to sample the area around it, but using all layers, and boom, it's gone. But now that action is on its own layer. So if I decide, well, actually I liked that lens flare, I can turn that layer off, and I haven't affected the bottom layer. So that would be the way to use that tool non-destructively. And we can decide if what we have up here, if these are artifacts or if these are real. Those could be bright stars up here. Let's see. Yeah, those are probably artifacts from those bright stars that were up here. And if I zoom in, this one doesn't appear to have any other information, so I'm just going to knock that out. This doesn't really appear to have any other useful information. It's basically it's just kind of a flat area. So again, I'm going to use the remove tool to remove that flat area and blend in some of the texture around it so that it's a little bit more natural. So that's probably all we're going to do with the remove tool. And so at this point, we want to continue processing this. And I want to apply some filters, and then we'll apply some adjustment layers. The first thing I want to do is sharpen this. And to do that, I'm going to use smart filters. And what a smart filter does is let you apply it to a smart object non-destructively, and you can always revisit that filter later if you want to change something. So we need to create a smart object, but now since I have some of my data on this blank layer above, I need to include these two layers, so both layers. I'll right click and choose Convert to Smart Object. And smart objects are kind of magical. They're almost like unicorns, that you can apply a filter non-destructively, come back later, change the filter. All that gets saved with the Photoshop document, so you can come back tomorrow, next week, next month, next year if you change your mind. So the first thing we'll do is, the little badge here tells us this is a smart object. First thing I want to do is apply some sharpening. So those are galaxies. So we'll go to Filter menu, Sharpen, and I use Smart Sharpen. And I find my files, because they're pretty high resolution from the ASI 6200, generally can stand a fairly large radius and a fairly high amount. So somewhere in this vicinity, and then click OK, and that will apply the sharpening. And another nice thing about smart objects is each smart object comes with its set of filters and also a mask for the filters and the ability to control the blending mode of the individual filters. And we'll get to those in a minute. So now we've sharpened this whole image. The next thing I might want to do is apply a little bit of local contrast enhancement. And to do that, this is an old trick from Photoshop way back when. We'll go to Filter, another Sharpen, and this time Unsharp Mask. And with Unsharp Mask, if we use a very large radius of pixels and a fairly high amount, we can effectively do the same thing that you might be doing with clarity or texture in Photoshop. It's actually creating halos, but you control the halos by the radius and the amount. And as I adjust this radius back and forth, hopefully it will update fast enough that we can see the effect. Let's just turn it way up. So that's too much. You can see how it's really enhanced that detail. A smaller radius or a larger radius. There's a larger radius. So you can just adjust this to taste, to something that looks like what you want your image to look like. And what it's doing is just highlighting the differences between lighter areas and darker areas. And we'll say that looks good, so we'll click OK. So now we have done just an overall sharpening, and then we've applied some local contrast through that unsharp mask trick. Sometimes we have little star residuals or just kind of noise that doesn't add anything to the image, and this doesn't really have it, but we'll pretend it does. And to get rid of that noise, we really want to use a blurring tool to blur and blend that noise. But we've already applied our smart filters here to the smart object, and we want those applied to the whole image. We could use this layer mask to selectively mask, but there's just one mask for all of these smart filters. So we can either have all of it or none of it anywhere you're masking. In order to apply another smart filter and use that mask selectively, what we need to do is turn this smart object again into another smart object. So I will right click, convert to smart object. So now it has taken all of those sharpening filters and combined that into a new smart object. Now I can use my blurring tool, which will go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches, and depending on how aggressive you need to be, it could be as low as 8 or 10 or as high as 30. We'll just kind of go for something in the middle of the road here at 15. Click OK. Because this is blurring, it's also blending the noise that is natural in the image. It makes it look unnatural. So we want to restore some of that noise, and to do that I'll go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise, and what this is going to do is put a little bit of random noise back into the image on top of this blurring filter so that those areas blend and look natural. Now we can do two things. First, this dust and scratches, historically on images like this where you're wanting to use it on stars and star residual, you want to use it in just darken blending mode. Fortunately, we can control the blending mode of each one of the smart filters using the little icon over to the far right. If I double click on the one associated with dust and scratches, it'll bring up some blending options for just that smart filter. And the main thing we want to do is go to the mode and change this to darken. And that will keep it from lightening anything, so it's a little bit less aggressive, and it's only being used to brighten things that were that were, I'm sorry, to darken things that were too bright, such as star residuals. The other thing we want to do now is click on the mask, and I want to invert this mask from white, which applies the effect everywhere, to black, which would apply the effect nowhere. And the easiest way to do that is to ensure the mask is what's active, and you can see the double outline. Control-I will invert the mask, so now we're back to a black mask which is hiding this effect in its entirety. But now we can use the brush tool and paint with white anywhere we want to see that effect. So we'll tap B to activate the brush tool. I have white as my foreground color, 100% opacity and 100% flow, and I can paint with white anywhere I want to apply that dust and scratches, that smoothing effect. And you can see it even updates on the thumbnail, so you can see where you've painted. And if we had little star residuals out here, this is just painting those away. And here's one we might actually want to take out, but it's in an area with detail, so I would make my brush smaller and then just click on those little spots that we want to remove. So that's how you would use the dust and scratches filter to clean up star artifacts and residuals and so forth. So we've pretty well got this smart object put together well. Let's add some adjustment layers. Typically the first one I would add will be a levels adjustment layer. And let's look at the background and see if it's truly black or if it has a color cast. We've got quite a bit of the reddish color, which seems to be the natural true color of the dust. But let's pick an area where there's just pure black background, if we can find one. And I'll come over to the eyedropper tool and choose the color sampler tool. And here's an area that looks like it's about as close to pure black background as we're going to find. And so I'll click there to drop a color sample point. And I can look at the color readout over here in the info palette. If you don't have the info palette, you can find it under Window and then just click to turn on the info palette. And once you have these palettes active, you can drag them around. So for instance, I can drag this whole palette around. Normally I leave it parked in this toolbar, and to get it back into the toolbar, I just navigate back over, and if I want to position it right there, you can see the blue line will show where I'm going to drop it. So there's the info palette. Click on that and that'll open it. Click on the little chevron and that will close it. So I like a background usually of about 19, 19, 19 for red, green, and blue values in the sRGB color space. So let's adjust this so that these values are 19, 19, 19. The ones on the left show the before an adjustment, the ones on the right show after an adjustment. So this is our adjustment, levels adjustment layer. And here in the properties panel are the actual sliders. And you'll see as I move these sliders around, not only does the image change, but also those numbers change. It's a little bit confusing in the levels adjustment, but there's two sets of adjustments. There's the three triangles under the histogram, and then there's two triangles under this bar at the bottom. The ones at the top would be pulling in the black layer. So if I move this to the right, it's making those numbers smaller. It's making the image darker at the dark end. This selects the kind of the black point minimum. And if I move it in, you'll see that it makes those black values larger. It's brightening the darks. So we want to actually adjust each one of these red, green, and blue individually. And some will have to go up, some will have to go down. And to address them individually, we'll use this drop down where it says RGB. We'll start with red. And red is currently at 10. We want it to be 19, so we need to make the numbers larger. I'll use this slider at the bottom, drag it to the right, and we'll see that number went up to, now we have 19 red. Switch to green, and again we're already a little bit too dark, so we'll adjust it up to 19. Blue is too bright, so we need to darken it. We need to make the number smaller, so we'll use this upper slider on the left hand side and drag it down. So now we have 19, 19, 19, so we have a pure neutral, and that's going to be our darkest point in the image. So I don't want to tinker with this levels adjustment layer anymore, so I'm just going to change the name, and we'll label this black point. And now I'll add another levels adjustment layer that we'll use to brighten the image overall selectively. And I'll start by moving the white point slider on the right hand side in, and that brightens the highlights. And you can see it's also moving the midpoint slider when you do that. And typically when you do that, you'll get a little bit of brightening in the darks. So we'll need to move this back over to get back to our 19, 19, 19. And now we have a little bit more pop and pizzazz in the image. We might even grab the midpoint slider and brighten those a little bit more. Again, watch our blacks stay at that 19 level. So that's actually looking pretty good. If we want to play with color and saturation, we would add, for instance, a color balance adjustment layer. And if you want to take some of that red out, you could adjust it here. If we want to adjust the saturation, I typically use the hue saturation adjustment layer. Most people would probably advise that you use the vibrance. I've never had trouble with hue saturation, so that's what I tend to use. And it has the option of having 3 tools in one. You can change the hue with the top slider, the saturation with the middle slider, or the lightness with the bottom slider. And you can also target either the master, or you can target individual colors. So you could, for instance, target reds and change just the saturation or just the hue of the reds if you wanted to. And we might want to take the saturation up or down, just depending on the image and your vision. My goal here is not to teach you how to make images that look like mine. I want to teach you how to use the tools to create images that look like yours. So I'm going to say that's good enough for the background for now. If we look at this and decide that, well, actually I want a little bit more sharpening, for instance, or if I want to clean up, here's some residuals, star residuals that I need to clean up. Let's go back and do that. So first let's clean up these star residuals. And we were cleaning those up with this Dust and Scratches Smart Filter. So again, I'll come back and click on the mask, because what we want to do is click and paint white on this mask any place we want to hide these residuals. Tap B for the brush tool. I'll make the brush quite a bit smaller, and then just paint over these areas that we want to clean up. And I don't know how well these are coming through on YouTube, but trust me, there's some little residuals there that it doesn't hurt to clean up. Now the next thing I might want to do is revisit our sharpening. If you remember, we applied sharpening and then to a smart object, and then we turned that into a smart object. So we need to kind of go back to that smart object. And that's part of the beauty of smart objects. If I click on the layer thumbnail icon here on this smart object and double click on it, it'll actually open the smart object that is, or the object that's inside that smart object. In this case, it was the smart object where we added sharpening, and let's just say we want to increase the sharpening. I can go to my Smart Sharpen layer, which is the one on the bottom. That's the Smart Filter. Double click on that. It tells us that it's only going to show us the effect of that one filter. And if I want to increase the sharpening amount, we can adjust that here. Click OK. And so now we have adjusted the sharpness of our base layer, and it's updating both the Smart Sharpen, and it'll also update the Unsharp Mask Filter. So we have a a fully refreshed smart object. Now, to put this back, if I just come up to the tab at the top of the, just below the toolbar, and you can see here's layer 1. If I click on the X to close this tab, it'll ask me, do I want to save the changes? I say yes. And what it's doing is not saving the file, it's saving it back into that smart object that we opened it from. And if you remember, what we opened it from was the smart object that had the dust and scratches filter. So now we have updated our sharpness. If we want to revisit any of our brightness adjustments, we can always come back and change anything. And as long as we keep it as a layered file, all of that stays intact. And that's the beauty of a non-destructive workflow. I tend to be very iterative in my process. So we still have this starless image, although it has a few galaxies floating in the background. Let's turn our stars back on and see what they look like. Yeah, a lot of stars. They're really hiding what's below. It's better than that original, but we need to knock these stars down a little bit. So I'm just going to close the RGB layer and let's open the stars layer. And if you remember, we have two layers. We have the sharp stars and the fluffy stars. The fluffy stars are adding to that a little bit, but not a great deal. Let's do a couple things. So first, let's start with this bottom layer, which is the sharp stars. I'll make this a little larger. And I'm going to turn this into a smart object. And we can do a couple things. First, we can knock out the little tiny stars that are just look like noise. And to do that, we're going to use that same dust and scratches filter, although this time with a much smaller radius. So we'll go to Filter, Noise, Dust and Scratches, and we'll use a setting of something like 4 pixels. And what that's doing is just knocking out the little stars. It's kind of treating them as noise or dust spots from the old days when you would be scanning film. If you want to be a purist and do this in darken blending mode, again, we can double click over here on the little icon and change our blending mode from normal to darken. Click OK. And because we're applying it so selectively, we don't have to worry about adding noise at this point. But that knocked the stars down somewhat. And if I turn that filter off and on, you can see the effect that it has. Let's add another smart filter. Let's just add some sharpening. So filter, sharpen, smart sharpen. And this also has a little bit of a star shrinking effect. We've got our settings way too high for stars, so we'll just drag the radius back down in the 2 or 3 range and pull the amount back into like maybe 200 or 300%. So it's somewhat less aggressive. And that will knock those stars down a little bit further. And then the last thing we'll want to do, as soon as this is done updating, and let me turn off our fluffy stars altogether. The last thing we want to do is darken the stars, because when you darken stars, you're in effect making them smaller. So we'll add a levels adjustment layer, and that goes above the sharp stars but below the fluffy stars. And we'll just drag the midpoint slider to the left, and the farther I drag it, the darker the stars and the smaller they get. So with those 3 moves, we now have the stars still present, but they're not hiding what's behind it. Now we're to a point where we can turn on the fluffy stars and get a better understanding of how they're really going to affect the image. And 43% appears too strong. That would be 0. So we want to just bring these in just enough to add a little bit of color and presence, but not hide anything behind it. And if we need to, we can add a levels adjustment layer on top of the fluffy stars. but we want it to affect just the fluffy stars. And the way you do that is by clipping this adjustment layer to the layer below it. And to clip it, you use this tool in the properties palette that will clip. Sometimes it's called a clipping mask, but what it does is clip this adjustment layer to the thing below it. And if you look at that adjustment layer, you see it now has this little downward pointing arrow. That tells us that that adjustment layer is clipped to the layer below it, and it will only affect that layer below it. So now we can independently darken just the fluffy stars a little bit. So I'm going to say that's pretty close to a finished image. Of course, you could continue tweaking and tinkering to your heart's content. If we wanted to adjust the saturation of the stars some more, we could add a hue saturation. Putting star fields over colorful nebula tends to knock the saturation out of the stars. So you find frequently that you need to add a lot of saturation in order to get the color to come through from the stars. Just for comparison, the starting point was there. That's the ending point. So I would say we've made quite a bit of progress with this image. Just to recap, we started in PixInsight. We did the usual integration. We applied some tools such as the dynamic background extraction and spectrophotometric color calibration. Then we used the suite of Russell Croman's tools, Blur Exterminator, Noise Exterminator, and Star Exterminator, to create our intermediate 16-bit TIFF files that we then brought into Photoshop, put into layer groups, turned into smart objects, applied adjustment layers in order to create this finished image. I hope you found this useful. If you do, again, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That really helps. Also, if you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. I'll do my best to try to answer them. And if you have any suggestions for something I missed or something you'd like to see in the future, drop those into the comments as well. Stop by our website at utahdesertremote.com and check out the content there. There are links to most of these videos, plus a selection of blog posts that just have some general information. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.